Welcome to the God Conclusion. I'm your host, John Leonard. Greetings, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the God Conclusion. I want to apologize for not having an episode ready for you last week. And I want to make a brief announcement going forward. I'm going to be doing podcasts every 2 weeks instead of every week. It's a little bit too much work to do all of this and keep up all the other work I've got going on. So for the near future, there'll only be one podcast every 2 weeks. Today's guest is Joseph Atwill, who is the author of Caesar's Messiah. I first became aware of this book when someone on my Facebook page commented and recommended that I read the book and interact with Mr. Atwill on this podcast rather than having a confrontation with just another Facebook follower. So I read Mr. Atwill's book, and I have some questions that I want to ask him. But before we get started, I want to issue a couple of caveats. I am not nearly the accomplished author that Mr. Atwill is. His book has been translated into multiple languages. I know it's available at least in German and French. You've studied Greek and Latin. You're very well educated. You're an academic. I think it's probably very safe to assume that you're a more intelligent person than I am. And I don't have a problem with that.
You can argue about that. As you get older, and I have that at least going for me, it changes from how you are different from people to how you are similar. And I have a feeling we would share great similarities.
And I'm looking forward to this conversation because just in the brief time that we spoke before we got started, you're a very cordial person, and I think it's going to be a pleasant conversation. Although, like I said, I do have some questions that are going to be a little tough, I think. But one other thing I wanted to mention was I was very impressed when doing the research for this podcast to find you are the first person I've ever communicated with that has their own Wikipedia page. There's a Wikipedia page for Caesar's Messiah. I don't know if you knew that or not.
I think I'm aware that there's a Wikipedia page for Caesar's Messiah. There may be one for me as well, but these aren't pages that I created.
No, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean to imply that.
People just set them up for whatever reason. I've really kind of, to some extent, stayed away from the promotion of Caesar's Messiah. I've always been ambivalent about the book. Not the accuracy of the analysis, which I think speaks for itself, but just how to communicate the information. I think the best way is just a word of mouth. People will read it, either think the analysis is coherent or not, and if they see fit, then they pass the information on to other people. The documentary was really the biggest promotion of the book. Millions and millions of people saw that, and
I wasn't aware that there's a documentary.
Yeah, it's a documentary, Caesar Messiah documentary. There's websites that promote it. The individual who made the documentary has a website, and I don't know how to verify this, but I've been told that 10 million people have seen it. So it's a lot of promotion, and I don't really, beyond that, don't need to do much.
No, I don't think you probably do with that kind of a promotion. And I apologize for not knowing about the documentary. I probably would have watched it.
Yeah, but already. I'm going to read the Wikipedia pages. I haven't actually done that. I'm curious about that.
So. Well, I need to temper your expectations a little bit, let's say. That I was a little bit surprised to see a couple of critical comments on your Wikipedia page from names that I easily recognized. The first was Robert M. Price, who is kind of famous in his own right for being a Bible mythicist or a
Yeah.
Jesus mythicist. And he said that you give yourself license to indulge in the most outrageous display of parallelomania
Yeah.
ever seen.
Yeah. That's interesting. I had a debate with Robert. It's online.
Yeah, that explains the sour grapes, perhaps.
Well, no, he wrote a critique of the book, and he had read it, but he didn't. The analysis just didn't appeal to him, and he ascribed the connections that I was seeing to what he called parallelomania. We had a debate online, and honestly, I think it was pretty one-sided. Bob had a hard time kind of keeping his position defended. But in any case, over the years, my analysis basically appealed to him. And he then produced a YouTube video people can look at called What I Have Learned from Caesar's Messiah. So he recanted his position. Wikipedia, I guess.
They might need to update their page there.
Yeah, but anyway, I know Robert is someone who is very open-minded, really rare in New Testament scholarship, which I would say generally has the kind of position that if you have written something, you have to defend it forever, regardless of the evidence that comes against it. Once it's in print, people rarely change their minds. I was in it was like a Yahoo thought circle that had maybe 50 authors of New Testament scholarship, maybe that many. And after a couple of years, this one guy, Rod Green, said, "What's funny," he goes, "none of us have ever changed the minds of any other person in the circle." And you wonder why we continue to have these discussions since no one ever changes their mind. It's very hard to either falsify or prove assertions concerning the New Testament. It's very difficult. There's always going to be some kind of sideways analysis that can occur to keep it from being just completely accepted as truth. Look at, like, for example, the synoptic problem with now you have Markan priority, which is regarded as likely, but it's never going to be resolved. There'll always be proponents of other kind of conclusions about that. So it's just the New Testament scholarship will always be, in my opinion, just kind of in a limbo. It'll never reach a point of complete understanding and accepted science. It'll always be something that will be seen as unclear.
In the biographical information that goes along with the book, you describe yourself, or maybe it was the introduction, you describe yourself as a former Christian. How would you describe yourself in general? Are you an atheist, or are you
No,
a humanist?
I wouldn't describe myself at all, frankly. I don't think any of those philosophies are particularly compelling to me. I grew up in a Catholic family. I grew up in Japan, and I was an altar boy, and was an altar boy using the Latin Mass. Talk about my ability to read Latin and Greek, not really very strong in those areas, but I did study them as a young man, and particularly Latin, because as an altar boy, you have exchanges with the priest, and so you have to understand the Latin that you're using. So I spent a lot of time as an altar boy and was very attracted to Catholicism. We studied catechism. I went to St. Mary's. Then it was called Military Academy. I think now it's just called St. Mary's. It's still in existence. It's a well-known school in Tokyo. And that training that I had for those years, which was really intensive in catechism, these were Christian brothers and Jesuits who were my teachers, and catechism was the most important subject. And so I didn't really have any traumatic experience. Sometimes there's rumors that I've had some kind of trauma with Catholicism. These are just fantasies. I just fell away from the faith as I became a teenager because there wasn't any kind of emotional connection to the religion after a while. And I was more interested in other things. And I just fell away from it. But I always retained the interest in Jesus as a historical character. And when the Dead Sea Scrolls became something of a scandal because of the questions concerning why aren't more of them being released to the public, and there were a lot of speculation about that, I started studying them And that was really what led to basically me writing Caesar's Messiah, was just the attempt I was making to understand this historical conundrum of how you could have two messianic movements in the same area at the same time, one being militaristic and one being pro-Roman and basically pacifistic.
Interesting. Before we get into my questions and issues with the book's contents, I think it's probably prudent to offer my interpretation of a brief summary, and then you can correct me if I'm wrong. But the premise of the book is that Christianity began after the Romans invaded Jerusalem in 70 AD. It was invented by the Caesars so that people would worship Titus because he was the conqueror of Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. And the New Testament was written in about a 6-month period between the reign of Titus and Vespasian. How much of that did I get correct?
I wouldn't agree with much of it. Basically, the thesis of the book is just that there is a typologic prefiguration of Titus's campaign that has been placed into the text of the Synoptic Gospels. And as to when it was written, I don't think you can really, with any specificity, say this. And it certainly wasn't written to produce a worshiping of Titus. In fact, it would be the typology, and this is a hard concept to explain clearly, but the typology is really for vanity. It's to create the idea of legacy for the Flavian family, because it wasn't just Titus and Vespasian, but also his brother Domitian, that they wanted to basically make the case that they had become the gods of the Jews. And so the typology is put into the gospel for the purpose of being able to enable an alert reader, someone who can understand the typology, to be able to know the identity of the person that Jesus envisions coming and conquering Jerusalem. Jesus predicts the coming of the Son of Man, and he indicates it'll be in 40 years. This is precisely when Titus came and fulfilled Jesus's prophecies. And the historian Josephus indicated that the messianic prophecies were about a Flavian Caesar, not about a Jew. When you look at the typology, you end up with an understanding of who the identity of the individual that Jesus was envisioning was. But this is the idea that it was put in for the purpose of worshiping Titus, or is, I think, incorrect, because it was actually written for posterity. They didn't put the typology in there so that people would understand it immediately. Obviously, until I wrote Caesar's Messiah, there'd been a few people who had understood it, but very few. And so it's a vanity piece. So what I would say the Gospels is basically they're kind of a literary version of the Arch of Titus. If you look at the Arch of Titus in Rome, you'll see the destruction of Jerusalem that Jesus envisioned. And then you see the proclamations about the divinity of the Flavians, that they are God the Father, the Son of God. So to represent that, their victory and their divinity, that was the purpose of the typology. So the Gospels have two purposes. One is simply vanity. It's like if you drive around Rome, you'll see dozens of monuments to the divinity of the Caesars. This was the era of the imperial cult, where the Caesars were making the case that they were divine, and they had all sorts of representations of that, both monuments and also literary declarations of their divinity. The Gospels are just a very clever way of creating another literary declaration of their divinity. So that was the sort of legacy vanity purpose of the Gospel, but they also had a political purpose in that following the war, the Caesars recognized that that they had won a battle, but not actually defeated the Messianic movement. In fact, subsequently, there were two more empire-wide violent rebellions by the Jews going forward. So the Caesars were attempting and then subsequently failed, but they were trying to transform Messianic Judaism into something that could abide inside the Roman Empire. And that was why that was the political purpose of the Gospels and the character of Jesus Christ.
Okay. I was under the impression from reading the book, and maybe I'm just not smart enough to understand what you were saying, but Titus invaded Jerusalem in 70 AD. So Christianity could not have existed prior to 70 AD.
Yes, that's right. Roman Christianity, well, let's back up. The Gospels were written post 70. This, I think, is understandable by most scholars because they have events from the war that are recorded in the Gospels. So obviously it was written following the war. But Christianity, Roman Christianity, could have been invented earlier. It's just that the Gospels would have been.
When you say Roman Christianity, you mean the modern church?
No, that's far later. But when you talk, so you have to be very come to an agreement about the terms. The Christianity is simply a religion which follows a messianic leader, Christ, Messiah. So it's a messianic religion. The movement that the Dead Sea Scrolls describe can be called a kind of Christianity. And beyond that, as far as when the Roman version of it began, this is not clear because Rome was always trying to tame the Jewish religion. They were trying to domesticate it, to bring it into the Roman Empire so that the Jews would not be rebellious. The family of Herod basically tried to breed a Christ. They had, for several generations, took Hasmonean brides and then had children with them, sent the child to Rome for training, brought the individual back, tried to present it to the population as a king. Again, Christianity, or modern Christians, tend to think of the term as being related to Jesus, kind of a divine individual, but it's really just, in general, a Jewish king who would be basically being a religious leader like David was. David was the first Christ, the first Messiah. He had the mantle of God, and he was a Jewish king. So going forward, trying to have some kind of Roman control over the religion, they were trying to control it through the leadership. The Herodian family, who were the Roman agents, made this effort to have an individual who had the Hasmonean lineage, which was seen as the lineage of the king at this point. Hasmoneans having been the royal family of Judea that the Herods replaced. So as to where you want to pinpoint the beginning of Christianity, it just depends on the semantics, how you want to define it. Now, in terms of the religion that comes out of the Roman production of the Gospels, this would obviously have been toward the end of the first century. The first historical Christians are, well, other than the characters in the Gospels, but the first really historical characters would be the individuals who are called the Christian Flavi. They are members of the Flavian family who are the first saints, like Domitilla, Priscillus, Achillas, Neros, Clement. These individuals are so numerous that, like, the Catholic Encyclopedia gives them a term, Christian Flavi, and they were members of the Flavian family or employees who were the early saints and the leaders of the church. And that would have been kind of when it began. Religion doesn't really begin with the Gospels. The Gospels are just it's a work of literature. As the religion comes into existence with bureaucracy and form and the attempt to have missionary activities, that would have been following the Gospels. And I think clearly by the end of the first century, you had an attempt to insert the religion to try to use it as a bulwark against militaristic Messianic Judaism, which was a real problem for Rome. That was Josephus recorded that the war between 66 and 73 was provoked by the fact that the Jews believed in the coming of a Messiah. So in other words, they took the stories in the Old Testament as a template with which they could understand their present reality. And they thought that a Messiah would lead them. And since there would be the power of God with this individual, they could overthrow the Roman Empire. This, I think, is kind of reflected in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But moreover, this Messianic movement against Roman occupation really started long before that war. It started, at least as Josephus recorded it, about the year 1. Year 1 CE, there was rebellion already against the Roman occupation. There was a series of them leading up to the war at 66. Then there was just a full-scale war in which they actually kicked Rome out of Judea for a period of time. Then there was kind of a quiet period. This was when the Gospels they attempted to insert them, but that was then followed. 115, you had the Bardoma rebellion, and then 133, Bar Kokhba. The 115 rebellion, which is not really well known, but there is historical data regarding, it was just an absolute genocidal bloodbath. They recorded that the island of Crete, or was it Cyprus? And one of those islands was conquered by the Jews, and they genocided all of the Gentiles on the island, 250,000 people. That is actually one of the data points. The area of Cyrenia, modern day Libya, that was also depopulated. So even though it's somewhat hidden to history, people aren't really aware of it presently very vividly. This was a series of genocidal, murderous wars between Rome and the Jews, and at the center of it was this Messianic movement that was, as Josephus stated, was propelling the Jews to rebel. So that was the milieu that the Gospels were created within, and that was what they were on the political level created for, to try to temper the violence.
Well, I have a confession to make. I kind of feel like Columbo. I listen to you and I feel like you know the Bible better than I do. You've read The Wars of the Jews by Josephus, and you did a lot of analysis there. And even though I had enough college credit to have a double major in history and political science. I more about early Roman history than I do. And I think I even had a class on Roman history at one point. But at any rate, even with those limitations, I still have some questions that I need to resolve in my own mind to be satisfied with what I'm learning here. And one of the questions is, I think we agree that there was a character, a historical figure that is known today as Jesus, who was born in the first year AD and was crucified in 33 AD. Is that fair?
No, I don't believe that.
You don't believe that Jesus existed? Yeah, well, I know that you called him Eliezer.
Lazarus. In other words, there were Christ. There were individuals who could be seen as the Messiah. And you get into semantical issues. Let me just explain my point and see what you make of it. I'm sure there was a Messiah that was historical. Josephus talks about this. To the extent he was the foundation for the character in the Gospels is impossible to know. No one really knows what was historical and what was not. I give an analogy to explain this, which is, I hope Christians don't see as insulting. I'm just trying to use these terms because for clarification, but we have the character Donald Duck. All right. Now, if the person who invented the character had a neighbor who had a duck named Donald, that was kind of a curious kind of neighborhood joke.
The inspiration.
It would be a kind of an inspiration. But that doesn't mean that when the author is creating a duck who can talk English, that he is creating a history. So in terms of the question about the historicity of Jesus, I just say I don't know, and I don't think it's possible to answer it. So it's not a question I have a lot of interest in. What I can answer is the nature of the literature. So I can answer that question. The literature is a typologic prefiguration, so that all of the stories about Jesus are based on other stories. The authors are not trying to create a history. Like in the case of Donald Duck, it's a cartoon. It's something it is a genre which is non-historical. So the Gospels are not an attempt to write history. There is history in them. For example, Jesus predicts that Jerusalem will be encircled with a wall and the temple will be razed. Now, those are historical events, right? so that history is being used as part of the creation of this literature. The literature, though, is not history. The characters are not historical. They are based, perhaps, in some cases, like in Simon and John's case. I think there were historical characters that they were founded upon. And even in the case of Jesus Christ, there were messiahs, not just one, but several that could have been inspiration for him. But that isn't what the authors are concerned about. They are concerned about creating a genre of literature which is prophetic, it claims to see into the future, and is also a prefiguration of Titus. That's the hidden meaning, is that, and then to like get people to understand like how prefiguration works. I don't go into my analysis of the Jesus Titus typology. I just go back to the beginning of the Gospels, first page of Matthew. You have what is known as the Moses Jesus typology. So all of the events of Jesus's pre-ministry have been taken from the Old Testament. The massacre of the innocents, the going into the wilderness, the temptations, these are all lifted from the Old Testament. The author has woven together and changed them, but they are identifiable, easily identifiable, because the author is making a point about identity. He's saying that all of these events in the pre-ministry of Jesus come from the story that is the Exodus, so the story of Moses, and that he's showing you that Jesus is he is presenting another savior of Israel with this character Jesus Christ. So you have Moses, all of these events of Moses's life make up Jesus's pre-ministry, and therefore Jesus is he's saying that the hand of God is creating this typologic relationship. These events are typologically linked. An alert reader can easily see that one event is based on the prior one, that Jesus's life is based on Moses, and then he can understand that the author is saying this is the new Moses.
I don't really know how to broach this, but I'm just gonna throw it out there. To me, your entire theory about Jesus being this mythical person and Titus and the figure of Jesus being typologically linked to Titus, it all requires that Christianity couldn't have been a thing prior to 70 AD. It could not have existed. And just citing what is generally consensus, the Gospel of Mark was written between 55 and 74 AD, which you gave the window of 70 and beyond. So 74 is beyond 70.
Yeah.
But the fact is that there are other books in the Bible that existed and clearly existed prior to 70 AD. For example, the book of Galatians was written, let me find when it was written. It was 10 or 15 years before. And another point that I was going to mention, you talk about Josephus and you emphasize the work of Josephus, but you also mentioned Tacitus and his contributions in this. And your general premise is both of these people were employed by the Flavian Empire to create this false history, this propaganda message to promote.
Tacitus and Josephus were on the payroll. That's correct. Flavian.
But Tacitus writes that Nero persecuted the Christians in Rome in 64 AD. And according to your theory, Christians couldn't have existed before 70 AD.
Right.
So who were these people that were being persecuted?
Right. Well, let me just try to clarify this. So the Flavian imperial court had their historians create a false history for the purpose of propaganda. And the evidence that I present to support that assertion is not what the historians wrote. I try to explain what they wrote by showing this typological pattern. In other words, I show that there was an attempt to create a prefiguration of Titus in the Gospels. And so my analysis is the evidence. Okay, you can take it or leave it, but this is the evidence. Now, when you come to Tacitus's quote, he is helping with the idea of the false history, right? That's how I would explain that passage. He's on the Flavian payroll, and even if the quote is real, many people don't think it was a later interpolation that was put into the passage, but assuming it's real, his passage concerning Christianity prior to the Roman war is exactly the same false history and is explained in exactly the same way as Josephus's testimonium. I'm sure you're familiar with Josephus having had the famous description of Jesus Christ.
I have the quote here in my notes, but I agree. It's generally considered that it's not. It's a partially fabricated quote. It's
Well, but
partial.
both the Tacitus and the Josephus quotes have been picked over. I don't really have any contention with them. They could have been interpolated later, maybe not. But in terms of my theory, they're both explained by the fact that I've shown that the Flavians were creating this false history. So once I've established that, then the Tacitus quote and the Josephus quote are part of what I explained. It goes back to whether or not someone accepts my assertion that you have this typological prefiguration of Titus's campaign in Josephus in the Gospels. Because bear in mind, I'm not really the nature of Christianity and its history. It falls out of that analysis. I can make what I would regard as intelligence conjectures about Christianity from my understanding of the nature of the Gospels and who wrote them and why. But it is not like the history that I am presenting to the public is documented or written anywhere. I go, look, here's the analysis. I would say just anyone, kind of reasonable reader who reads the analysis would recognize that there's something that has been hidden from our eyes. The nature of the typology is clear cut enough so that people can go, well, there's something wrong with the Gospels. This should have been understood years before. Why is this not understood? And then from that, my understanding of the history of Christianity will simply fall out. But it's not like I'm saying, here's a book where all this stuff is documented. You have to recognize that the typology was created, recognize that it was the team that created the works of Josephus. That work is identified to having been produced inside the Flavian court. And moreover, that work and the Gospels were created simultaneously because typology is very difficult genre to write. You're juggling two different works and you really can't, or it's very difficult to produce it in separate phases. You'd want to create it at one time. So this identifies where the Gospels were written, of course, but also when they were written during the time that the histories of Josephus were written.
What you mean, the War of the Jews?
And Antiquities, yeah. Josephus wrote two books.
Yeah, I know Antiquities is where the Testimonium Flavinium
Yeah.
comes
So
from.
it was during the period where the histories of Josephus were being written, probably a 10-year span, I would say, probably maybe 80 to 90, 95. It was in there that you would have had the production of the Gospels.
Well, again, the Gospels were not the only evidence for Christianity. You've got the rest of the New Testament, and much of that New Testament comes from prior to 70 AD. Galatians was written between 55 and 57 AD, and First Corinthians was written 53 to 54 AD. And Paul was dead before 70 AD. He was dead at 65 AD.
Unfortunately, what I would maintain is that there is no real historical citation for that. The dating of Paul just comes from the fact that Paul maintains that's when he's writing, and that isn't any more plausible in my mind or confirmed in my mind than the fact that Jesus is walking around Judea between 30 and 33. These are just assertions that are being made. And again, I explain Paul in my second book, Shakespeare's Secret Messiah. I go into Paul, I decode him, and I show how the literature is created and what it means and the little secret kind of cues that are hidden in it. It is, in my opinion, just more Flavian false history. Paul is, and in fact, I would say Paul is exactly like the Tacitus quote. If you accept the assertion of the typology, and I would say, in my opinion, I think it's basically demonstrated by my analysis that this was something that was produced in the Flavian court following the war. If you accept that, then the identity of Paul and the dates that all of that falls away, and you have to assume that's just part of the false history.
Weren't Tacitus and Josephus recording contemporary history?
No, they're writing propaganda.
But propaganda set in contemporary time.
Sure. Well, just like the Gospels.
So people would have recognized that it was propaganda.
Well, not
But
necessarily.
within 200 years, okay. Why not?
Well, because the nature of propaganda is that it wishes to be hidden. If it is overt, then it doesn't work as propaganda. That is just I don't mean to be dismissive, but your use of the term propaganda is not grammatically correct. In other words, if it is meant as propaganda, it is meant to be hidden.
I have to think about that. See, I mean, to me, you're falling in the same category with Richard Carrier and Robert Price's saying that Jesus wasn't a historical figure. And then you've got most other historians, and Bart Ehrman is a name that I'm also familiar with. And I'm sure you know his name as well and know that he's not a Christian. But in fact, he had a quote that was on that Wikipedia page where he said that he knew sophomores in college could rip your thesis to shreds, and said that you had no training in any relevant field. And I dismiss that, his criticism, as the arrogance of academia.
Well, I mean, the criticism in some sense is correct, but on the other hand, in debate, I am sure I would win. And I attempted to arrange it with Bart, but even though he was trash talks with his statement, he wouldn't actually sit down and have a public conversation with me. And so this is just New Testament scholarship. I'm not an academic in that field or in any field. I'm not part of academia. And so the criticisms in many cases from academics, I think, have been out of jealousy because my book was more popular than theirs. And so this upset a lot of people. That would be how I would explain some of it. But in fact, a lot of academics actually came around to liking my book. I have blurbs on my book from three really
I saw that.
well-known New Testament scholars. And I think the most significant one is from Harold Ellens, because Dr. Ellens he was a Christian. And he was also the technical referee, basically, in what was called the Society for Biblical Literature, which is kind of the top of the food chain of New Testament scholarship. And he was so expert that he was actually given, I think he was the head of it, and then ran the peer review he would criticize academic papers that came to it. But he was very supportive of the work, and he didn't agree with it. He said, I can't, as a Christian, and he says, I can't really come all the way to believe in it, but you've definitely come across something that is worthy of criticism and it should be something New Testament scholarship addresses. And so
I agree with that analysis. Your book is very well researched, and your arguments are very clear and concise. I just disagree with them because I think that they've got some fundamental flaws in them.
Sure.
If what you're saying is true, then nothing resembling Christianity could have existed prior to 70 AD. And then you have to go back to, well, what happened between the year 33 AD and 70 AD that 40 years after the fact, this basically unknown wandering Jewish rabbi or preacher is wandering the countryside, is made famous by the Roman Empire on purpose. And then within a couple of 100 years, the entire Roman Empire is consumed by this new religion that was an obvious fabrication in 70 AD. To me, you don't have that kind of a disconnect because the people that were reading Tacitus and Josephus at the time that they were written, they should have had some understanding of current events. I understand what you're saying, that propaganda is propaganda and it's meant to deceive. But then I go, the old Latin question, cui bono? Who benefits from this fraud? And I don't see the advantage of creating this new religion to worship Titus when they built a temple of Vespasian and Titus in Rome. So he was already deified.
Yeah, they didn't write it because they wanted to deify Titus. It is a clever kind of declaration of divinity, but it wasn't created to promote the cult of Titus. It was created just for the result that it produced, which was
Then why do it?
well, the political purpose, as I explained, was they wanted to domesticate Messianic Judaism. The reason why this is perplexing to you is you're trying to put the question in our present moment and try to look at how we see Christianity and then relate my analysis to that. I would suggest you go back to the time when the Gospels are being produced, and then the answer.
Well, but then we're going to get into disagreements because, first of all, I'm going to say that there's other parts of the New Testament that arguably were clearly developed before 70 AD.
Oh, wait, back up, John. Can you give us a citation for that?
Well, I just took notes, but I wrote down.
I don't mean like there are people who would say this is when it was written, but you have to understand that the dating of Paul is just completely imprecise. There isn't carbon 14 dating or other individuals who knew Paul during this time who wrote about him. All you have are the letters of Paul. And if you buy the descriptions of history that the letters are using to produce themselves as authentic, as historical statements, then you have the dating of Paul that you and all of Christianity maintain. But if you go, well, could they be fictionalized? Well, the answer is, of course, they could have been. And then particularly then when you look at the analysis I produce of the Gospels, now they are very suspicious because now you go, well, wait a second, this character seems to have been part of all of this false history propaganda. Here's why Paul, you'd have to get into Paul, you'd really want to get into the analysis that I produced in Shakespeare's Secret Messiah when I show how Paul relates to typology. But just in general, when you have when they produce the story of the Gospels, you have this period of time between the death of Jesus and when the religion actually becomes a historical fact. And so they have to insert some false history into that somewhere in that period just to create a little historical falsification to make it plausible that this religion came out of Judea in 33. And let me just give you an easy way to understand the fictionalization here of Paul. There's one very simple way to do this. Jesus was established in the Gospels as a human Passover lamb. I'm sure you're familiar with this.
Oh, yeah.
Fact. Okay, so he is the human Passover lamb of the new covenant, right? He's set up as the Passover lamb by how they crucify him. They don't break his bones. They touch him with hyssop. And he talks about eating my flesh and things like this. So he is a human Passover lamb, and he is sacrificed on 33 AD. This is the date of his sacrifice as the starting point of this new covenant religion. Remember, it's replacing the old covenant, the old Passover lamb story with the new covenant and the new human Passover lamb as a starting point. So in the old covenant, you have 40 years between the Passover and when you have the entrance into the Holy Land or the Promised Land, right? You have 40 years of wandering. Now, if you date Jesus's sacrifice at 33, you would then, since they are mirroring,
I remember that from the book.
They're mirroring this time period. They're mirroring the process of creating the old covenant. They're mirroring that to the new covenant. So you have to go 40 years into the future and say, well, what happens at that date? And that is the precise date in history that Rome took complete occupation over Judea. So this obviously conceptually is the mirror in the new covenant to the old covenant. But the fact is, John, this couldn't have occurred. You couldn't write that until following the war because you couldn't back calculate from the end of the war to the date of Jesus. So in other words, this explains why they dated Jesus to 33, his sacrifice to that date. They dated that from the precise moment of the end of the war when Rome controlled Judea. But what that does is, of course, shows that period of time, the time during which Paul would have existed, is just all part of the false history that they're making with the dates and with the character of Jesus Christ and with the prophecies concerning the Roman war that were written after the fact. Like, obviously, well, most people will accept that when Jesus talks about encircling the city with a wall or the raising of a temple, these are events from the war, and it was written after the war, obviously, so that they created this idea that the individual could see in the future.
It is possible that they were written after the war,
Right. Well, yeah,
but it is also possible that they were written before the war and they were prophetic.
sure.
And just because we tend to not believe in prophecies and things of that nature, that tends to appeal to our disbelief. We're inclined to reject that in favor of what's a pretty amazing conspiracy, in my opinion.
Sure. Well, the
And
thing,
I'd like to take a step back
of
and kind
course,
of
of course.
explain my perspective and where I'm coming from. I wrote a book called The God Conclusion, and it was in response to Richard Dawkins. And in my book, I tried to not use the Bible at all as a source. And I only refer to the Bible in one chapter where Dawkins really went to task with the Old Testament in particular. And I felt compelled, because I was responding to him chapter by chapter, to respond to his book and comment on the Bible where it was appropriate. But other than that, I put the Bible on a shelf and I said, I only want to use logic and scientific evidence to make my argument for a God. And I don't care about what identity you want to give this God. If you want to call God Odin, that's up to you. I'm just trying to establish the facts that demonstrate it's more overwhelmingly likely that some sort of a supernatural creator exists than does not. So, from that standpoint, I'm not a Christian apologist and I'm not an evangelist. I don't have any formal training. And I repeat what I think I said earlier, which is I believe firmly that you know the Bible better than I do. I believe you studied it better than I have. That doesn't affect the questions that I have, but it does give me pause as I'm challenging you, because I know I'm up against, to use a word, a very worthy adversary or worthy challenge to what my argument here. And you wrote that Josephus recorded history to demonstrate that Daniel's prophecies came to pass in 70 AD. And Josephus goes overboard to make certain his readers come to that conclusion. It was one of the primary reasons the first Christians believed in Jesus's divinity. And for some reason, this knowledge has been lost and is no longer understood today, even by New Testament scholars. Now, here's the little bomb I got to drop.
Okay.
Isaiah 53. If you take Isaiah 53 out of the Bible and show it to people just on a blank piece of paper and show them the text and say, what is this and who is it about? They'll say it's something Christian that's about Jesus. And the problem is that was written 700 years before Jesus, or 600 years before Jesus lived. So to claim that prophecies are just nonsense, it's very difficult unless you believe that the entire Bible was fabricated, that something like that could exist. And I've listened to the testimony of Messianic Jews talking about Isaiah 53, and they say, when I first heard about Christianity, I thought it was an Italian religion. I thought Jesus was a Catholic. And I read the New Testament, and I read that it's books written by Jews, or claimed to be written by Jews, about a Jewish man in a Jewish community And that was one of the questions I had was, how did they know so much about Judaism if they're Romans, if they're pagans? And you do kind of explain that by Josephus was one of the guys who was involved, if indeed your theory holds true. But I don't understand how a book like Isaiah 53 or a chapter like Isaiah 53 can exist in a book that was written 600 years before Jesus allegedly lived. And I know that Jesus wasn't his real name. Yeshua was his real name. And the reason I don't argue Christianity in my book is because I wanted to make a positive attack against atheism, because I think it's a foolish belief system, and present that there is something. I mean, it could be the God of Einstein, the God of Spinoza, but there's something out there. And then whatever you want to call him, you can call him. I personally called this guy Jesus, but that wasn't his name 2,000 years ago. It was Yeshua or something similar. But have I lost you?
No, following exactly your train of thought here. Yeah. Just waiting to respond. I have a response to it, of course.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. But the academic effort that you put in is obvious in your book. You've got translations of words, stones as Abanim and Banim as sons, and you make a very compelling argument that there's word confusion in the usage of these terms. And I know that also back in the Old Testament times, they didn't even have vowels. So there's no guarantee that these were the words that were intended to be interpreted as such. But overall, my belief in Jesus came from a period of intellectual agnosticism. I was a computer professional, much like I wasn't in your league. I worked in computers for a couple of decades, but you started several computer companies. And that's why I'm trying to show respect for your intellect and your accomplishments, but also challenge what you're saying.
Sure. And so I was just nowhere as a programmer. I was more involved in the financing and kind of that aspect of and promotion of the businesses and trying to help arrange sell them and stuff like that. So I was a business. I knew how to code, but I wasn't really involved in that way very often. And I just wanted, but having cleared that up, I just have a question. And I'm curious as how you would answer it. So you talked about Isaiah 53 and how it appears to be prophetic to the story of Jesus Christ. Okay, that's a well-known position. So just for the sake of argument, if my understanding of when the Gospels were written is correct, can you explain from that perspective, how would Isaiah 53 have ended up inside the story of Jesus Christ? How would you explain it? Say you're writing the Gospels and you've got the Old Testament there. How would they get? So my question is, can you imagine a way that they would be able to use Isaiah 53 as a template for the story?
Yes, but they would have to have profound and intimate knowledge of Judaism from the time of Isaiah and before. They'd have to know Judaism inside and out, which I understand that's your argument. That's Josephus's role in this. That's the thing of arguing about Christianity as opposed to arguing about the existence of God. I can give an argument about God that I think is pretty doggone bulletproof. But when it comes to Christianity, I'll be the first to concede it's something that you have to take with a degree of faith. And I don't have an issue with that. I just think that there is more evidence that supports the more traditional view of Christianity than your view, just based on the dates that are given for some of the writings of these books, like
Sure.
Galatians and First Corinthians.
Yeah, I was, in terms of the capacity to write the Gospels, I'd point out so that they had Josephus, who was on their payroll, and he actually took the position that the messianic prophecies, which are applied to Jesus, did not indicate a Jew. He said that they actually are predicting the Flavian Caesar. Josephus recorded that, which, of course, is the same position that is found in the Gospels, where Jesus envisions the Son of Man, which is a title for the Messiah, coming in 40 years. So if this is Titus, then Josephus and the Gospels have the same political understanding of messianic prophecy, which is very suspicious. But the fact is that I'm not even sure Josephus is a real person. I wouldn't be surprised if it's just a nom de plume. There is a historical individual and family, I think, that is far more likely to have produced the Gospels, and that's the family of the Alexanders. Now, here you have Philo Alexander, who is certainly the most famous Jewish intellectual of this era.
I'm familiar with Philo.
Okay, so Philo was, now his family is part of the Flavian intellectual team. His nephew, Tiberius Alexander, was the Flavian general during the siege of Jerusalem. So this family was the wealthiest family, evidently, in the Roman Empire. They had the tax farm of Egypt. And Philo's brother was the Albarch, the tax collector, the head honcho of the Egyptian area. This was the family that I think oversaw the production of the Gospels. They were completely over religion. They could care less about Judaism. They were Jews, evidently. They claimed to be historically Jews, and they certainly knew a lot about Judaism. In fact, they wrote the book, basically. Philo's interpretation of the allegories in the Old Testament are kind of foundation pieces for understanding Judaism of the era. So this is the group that was in this Flavian court thought circle. You have Josephus, the Alexanders, who are Jews, who are intellectuals, but are completely opposed to the Messianic movement that rebels from Rome because they were losing money from it. And there's also the family of the Herods, who are converted Jews, and they've interbred with the Hasmonean family, so they are basically Jewish intellectuals. They also are losing money from the Messianic rebellions. And so there is as I wrote in the book, you have the capacity, the motivation, and the opportunity. If you're going into a trial situation, you'd want to find those three items that can be ascribed to the person you're trying to make the accusation of being guilty regarding. So with the Flavian court, you've got the motivation, the opportunity, and the capacity. And as I point out, this isn't really known anywhere else. This group, the Flavian intellectual circle, is the only group that had all three of those attributes. They certainly had the motivation to try to tame Messianic Judaism with their character, Jesus Christ. They certainly had the opportunity because they're the ones who controlled propaganda. The Roman roads were a device that Caesar used to maintain control over information. And then they had the capacity. They had not just the understanding of of Hebraic literature and of Hebraic prophecy and of Hebraic typology, all of which ends up in being used in the Gospels, but they also had the technical ability to write the Greek, because the Greek has a lot of what's called the technical terms from the imperial court. A lot of the words which describe religious aspects of Jesus and of the religion are found in descriptions of the divine Caesars. And these are very fancy words, they're not in the common vernacular, and yet they pop up in the Gospels, which is far-fetched if, in fact, they were written by, Jewish kind of religious converts to Christianity. So as far as the logic that's supporting the production of the Gospels in the Flavian court, I think is pretty strong, because they honestly had they had the motivation, the capacity, and the opportunity, and I don't really know of anywhere else that existed.
Well, this is a very interesting conversation. I see that we're a little bit over an hour, and we had talked before. I know you've got a couple other interviews
Yeah,
to
I've
do
got
today.
talking today, but I tell you, John, I just wanted to make sure I'm available to you. This could be the beginning. Like, I'm sure there'll be ideas that I've had, which you could find error within, and you'd want to come back and correct whatever you want, or perhaps there's some inspiration. But let me just say I'm available to you. This conversation may need to go on a couple more sessions, and I'm sorry, but I have a lot of talking today, and I've got to save my.
I want to be respectful of your time. And so, what I'd like to do in closing, I think, is just say this. Your book is, like I said, extremely well written, and it's very academically based. And if you are correct in your theories, I think you might be the smartest person on this planet today. But the only person that might be smarter than you would be the person that came up with the idea of this black satire of the Gospels, a forgery, a clever forgery of an event that never took place. If that happened, that person is responsible for fooling billions of people
Well,
over
you got John
2,000 years.
One of the reasons I told you, like, I was very ambivalent about releasing Caesar's Messiah. I actually put the analysis in a drawer for like 2 years while I thought about whether or not it's a good idea even to bring it out. And I brought it out eventually because I thought, well, it's really not my decision. I did the analysis. Some people find value. Maybe some people will have really negative responses, but I should hope for the best here and bring it out. I think it's correct. I think it's worth discussing. So let's bring it out. And I'm still not sure if it was a good idea. But one thing I will say is that I like the fact that it encourages skepticism of the ruling class. You talked about how clever they were. If I'm right and they produce this, if it is propaganda for social control, then I would hope that message is the vivid one that comes out of people reading Caesar's Messiah, is that we're in a world in which, in my opinion, the political class is very sophisticated at propaganda, and the public is very gullible and vulnerable. And so if there's one thing that is purely good that can come out of this book, it's that people should be more and more skeptical of narratives that are given to us by the people that we think are in our favor, who have political power. I think we really need to have a real revolution in terms of a human understanding of our political class and the way they manipulate us.
I changed my mind. I've got another ending for this podcast. I'm going to quote you. You wrote that understanding that Christianity was a government project will help produce a new understanding of government. And my notes after that said, if you mean a more cynical understanding, it's kind of difficult to imagine that my current view of government could get any worse than it is. But
Yeah. See, you're a victim of your intelligence.
yeah.
I mean, that's just how it is. But we really have to be. I mean, if democracy in any form is going to survive, the population has to up their game, because you know that the oligarchs and the political class are developing technology for social control and propaganda. So if we're going to survive, we have to up our game too. And that starts with more skepticism.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, my friend.
Thank you, John. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to The God Conclusion. If you like this episode, please consider subscribing to this channel. Join us again next week as we continue to seek truth. Quid est veritas.